Recharging the Human Battery here on AM 950 Radio. Dr. Sinacropi is unable to join me today, so you get me, his co-host, nurse practitioner extraordinaire, Mandi Dickey. I have a few things today on my own that I want to talk about. I know Dr. Sinacropi's had a couple episodes where he's just been here and it hasn't been the two of us. So there are a few things I wanted to talk about today. First being a quick little warning that I unfortunately had another head injury a couple of weeks ago while I was on vacation. So in case I do have any slip-ups with my words, I do feel like I've taken a couple of steps back in my recovery, unfortunately, which is one of the topics that I want to talk about today. So when we come back from the break, I'll be talking a little bit more about what happened with my second injury here and just kind of that incidence of second injury syndromes. What happens when somebody has an injury and then why we tend to have more injuries after that and how that kind of trickles down to other things in medicine that we see on a regular basis, actually. So that's the first topic that I wanted to talk about. And a couple weeks ago, Dr. Sinacropi had talked about the physician shortage. He went into great detail on that last episode a couple of weeks ago about the physician shortage, what's kind of leading to that shortage, and how people like myself, nurse practitioners, can help fill the gaps. And I thought, what better time than to explain a little bit more about what a nurse practitioner is and how we are part of that team, just so you know who all is in your corner and who's there to help take care of you in times of need. So that's going to be the second part that we're going to talk about. And then along that line, I kept thinking about all these different things related to it because we tend to get off on tangents on our conversations. Just what does it look like all of the different options that we have in healthcare? I think so many of us think about our traditional medicine that we go into an appointment, we get our immunizations, we get our diagnostic tests, order our medications, and then we go. And that's kind of our typical way that we think of here in the United States, at least, about what medicine looks like. But there are so many other options, and we've alluded to several of them on different episodes of this show. And I wanted to dig a little bit more into that and talk a little bit more about some of those other options that we see. Because you might hear something today that you didn't know about before, and it might be another option to help you in being that CEO of your own healthcare, as we've talked about over and over again on the show here. So all of these things we'll talk about more in much greater detail on the other side of the break. And if you have questions, comments on the show, please leave those, and we'll address those in future episodes. Welcome back, folks, to Recharging the Human Battery here on AM 950 Radio. I'm here, your co-host, Mandi Dickey. And as I mentioned before the break, the first thing I really wanted to talk about today is that incidence of secondary injuries. So, again, kind of going back to my second injury, again, here a couple of weeks ago. So I had a great vacation, took the family up to the Boundary Waters, northern Minnesota here. We got a new camper for our trip, had the awning out. You know what that looks like with those metal arms that hold the awnings out. Well, I'm still recovering from that TBI that I had last year, and because of that, I'm still having these leftover symptoms of visual difficulties, comprehension of what I'm seeing, where I'm seeing it, how am I doing with distance, having things around me. And I saw the awning, I saw it hanging there, and I still somehow walked right into it, smacked my head right into that metal edge of the awning arm, and just about knocked myself out. So if you've heard anything about when people have concussions, if they have a secondary concussion, that can cause greater injury. And if your brain is still trying to heal from that first injury, that causes increased risk of having more damage occur. There's actually a thing called second impact syndromes. And we talk about this a lot with kids that are in sports and they play rough sports where they might get that head injury, football, soccer, hockey, things like that, where if they are still trying to recover from that initial injury and they have a second injury on top of that, they can actually end up with permanent brain damage. And it can be so severe to the point where there's brain swelling, and it can lead to really, really bad outcomes for people. Mine was not to that point, but it was to the point where it made it difficult for me to comprehend what was going on that day. I don't remember much of that particular day of my vacation, and ever since that point, I've had more troubles with word finding again. So I'm much more slow and more deliberate in my speech so that I can come up with my words a little bit better. So I thought this was a great opportunity to talk about what that means when somebody has that secondary injury. So I started looking a little bit, and well, actually first, when I was talking with my kids at home, we were talking about how what happens when you're eating and you bite the inside of your mouth, right? You bite the inside of your mouth, the inside of your cheek, or the side of your tongue, it swells. And then you have that greater risk of biting it again. And it always drives us bonkers, because why does something happen like that when you bit it, and then you have this second insult that you have that greater risk of having it happen again and again? It's the same kind of thing, and there's a lot of research out there to show that when somebody's had a head injury, that actually puts them at higher risk for having more injuries because of the symptoms that are left over. Like I mentioned, the visual difficulties that I have. People have issues with their balance, with just understanding in space and how they feel, and sensory issues. And all of those things put somebody at risk of having yet another injury because your idea of where you are in space is not right. You just don't feel right, so it makes it that much more of an injury-prone activity going on for the next thing that you do. So then I started looking at some of the research, and there was a study that found that high school players that have a catastrophic head injury, 71% of those had another head injury in that same sports season prior to that catastrophic injury. And related to that, there was another study that found that about 13% of all high school athletes had recurrent concussions. And I think it's safe to say that we probably all know at this point that these numbers might not necessarily be accurate because people don't report the concussions. They're not diagnosed as well. And I think we talked about that early on in the show, but it's really difficult to get those concussions diagnosed appropriately and have people report them, because there still is a lot of stigma. If you're playing as an athlete, you don't want your coach to know that you had a concussion all the time, because that means you're going to have less play time. You're going to get off. Have to spend time off the field. And if you have some other kind of injury, you don't want to. If you get in a car accident, you fall, you hit your head, any of these other injuries, people tend not to report their symptoms. For one, because they don't want to. They don't want to take time to go get the health care done. And then other times because in the case of me, when I first had my head injury, I wasn't really even aware that I had issues. So that's a very common reason why people might not report those issues also, just because they don't recognize them and they don't identify them as issues. So because of that, I think that incidence of having that second injury is probably a little bit higher even than what we can find in those numbers, because it's not reported from the first one. And if it's not reported, people aren't getting the care that they need. Therefore, their brain might still be in that recovery stage when that second injury happens. So then, in medicine, there's always this trickle-down effect, and there's always something else that you can compare it to. And this whole idea of secondary injuries or secondary illnesses shows up all over in medicine. So, to give you a little bit more about myself, several years ago, I was diagnosed with an autoimmune disease. I should say at least one, because there was only one that showed up positive in the testing, but it didn't match all the symptoms that I had. So the provider team that I had said I probably had at least one more, but they couldn't identify what there were. And there are so many autoimmune diseases. So let me back up for a moment to tell you what an autoimmune disease is, if you're not familiar with what it is or why it's there. Autoimmune means essentially that your body is attacking its own cells, auto being its own cells. So your body sees its own cells as foreign. This can be triggered by stress, by a virus, by any kind of illness, by surgery. Anything that's a stress on your body, whether it's emotional or physical, can trigger this autoimmune response. Sometimes we might have autoimmune illness in our families, and so we're predisposed to it, but it doesn't show up until it's been triggered. Or sometimes it comes out of the blue. It doesn't have to be there in your family, but you had this significant illness and now you have an autoimmune disease on top of it. And then I thought, again, thinking on tangents, I got to thinking about back when I was in nursing school and we learned about these autoimmune diseases, and we learned that once you have one autoimmune illness, you're at higher risk of having others. Now, I can't tell you the why on that, and I'm always a why person. I love to know why things are the way they are. We don't exactly know why people have second and third and potentially more autoimmune illnesses once they have one, other than to explain that once you have that autoimmune illness and your body is already seeing its own cells as foreign, it starts to do that more often in your body. So it's easy to have that one diagnosis and then you have another one. And these secondary diagnoses show up, again, over and over in medicine. When we talk about somebody who's at risk for other issues, when one organ in your body starts to have disease from the damage from the effects of your disease, then it can lead to other illnesses in your body. If you're on medications to treat that disease, that can lead to other illnesses in your body. So examples of this, really good examples, are heart attack and stroke. When we talk about heart attack and stroke, we always talk about those risk factors for it, right? So what puts you at risk of having a heart attack and a stroke? Things like high blood pressure and diabetes are right on that list. So high blood pressure and diabetes, having those diagnoses puts you at risk for having another diagnosis. It puts you at risk for having a heart attack or a stroke. Other things like that. Obstructive sleep apnea increases the risk of high blood pressure, also increases the risk of stroke. Migraine increases the risk of stroke. I could go on and on and on, and I could probably do an entire episode just listing out all of these things that could be related to each other. And then it got me thinking about how several years ago I actually gave a presentation at the Minnesota Brain Injury Alliance about the relationship between stroke and brain injury. So having a stroke puts you at risk for having a brain injury. And I think some of us can kind of put those two together, because if you have a stroke and you have leftover weakness, that makes you prone to falling and potentially getting a head injury that way. But the reverse is also correct. If you have a head injury, that puts you at more risk of having a stroke, which I found fascinating when I was doing this research. And it explained so many things with different patients that I had taken care of, including one that I was taking care of at the time that I was writing the presentation. So just having that stroke changes the chemistry in your brain. It changes your neuroanatomy to the point where it increases your risk of having a brain injury and vice versa. So we see it all the time. As I mentioned, all of these different examples that I've given you, one diagnosis can lead to another. And then we talk about medicines. So I know we've kind of vilified medicines on this show from time to time, and there is absolutely a place for them. As a practitioner, I have prescribed medications my entire practice because there is a role for them. But it is important to note that sometimes the medications that we use cause side effects and can potentially cause problems in your body. For example, if you have one of those autoimmune diseases and you have to be on a steroid, long-term steroid use or intermittent for multiple times steroid use can actually increase the risk of developing diabetes and high blood pressure. And if you've been listening to any of this, it's this big cycle that we get in, that one diagnosis can lead to another, and they all kind of intertwine in that way. And I remember years ago, I was living in southern Minnesota. This was over a decade ago now. I worked in a clinic over in La Crosse, in a stroke clinic. I had started up this stroke clinic, and I did a lot of education, not only with my patients, but their family members that came in, other healthcare providers. I educated our entire system on the stroke clinic, all the risk factors, what we could do to try to decrease people's risk of having another stroke or having a first one to begin with. And that constantly included talking about the person's primary diagnosis that they have. What diagnosis do they have that puts them at risk for having the stroke, such as the diabetes and high blood pressure that I mentioned? And I know we talked about this last week a little bit, but those lifestyle modifications absolutely have a huge impact on our health. And I learned it in school. I've learned it multiple times since then. They absolutely have more of an impact than the medications that we use. Sometimes they make those medications work better, but they definitely have more of an impact. So if we can get into that idea of lifestyle management and lifestyle modification, and when I say that, what does that mean? It means that if we look at our diet and our exercise, that can have a huge impact on any of these diagnoses that we talk about, from little teeny seasonal allergies. If you have a really good diet and you exercise on a regular basis, your seasonal allergies won't bother you as much as they could. So lifestyle makes so much of an impact, and yet we don't often think about it. So when we talk from a healthcare perspective, as your provider sitting there and we're talking about ways that you can try to be healthier, This is, again, being the CEO of your own healthcare because you have all of the power here. Yes, we can prescribe a medication for you, and sometimes we need to prescribe that medication to get things rolling. So we need to address whatever new diagnosis that you have, and we start the medication because it will cut into the effects that you're feeling so that you feel better, and it allows you to make those lifestyle changes. And other times, it might be better just to start with the lifestyle modifications. So what do I mean by that? We always use these things, and I laugh when I hear some of the commercials on TV and radio that say to eat healthy and eat a healthy diet. But do we really know what that healthy diet looks like? Again, we talked about it a little bit on last week's episode, that I brought up the idea of the standard American diet being the SAD diet, because if we all follow that standard American diet, we will all have various health conditions as we go along. And our foods are not the same as what they were 100 years ago. So if we think about the foods that our parents and our grandparents grew up on, it's not the same foods that we're buying on the shelves now. Just think back a few years to how packaging looked different. So your food looked different even just a few years ago than it does now. But we have mass-produced foods so much too that it's definitely not the same foods. They cannot do the same healing powers, even if the people that are 100% organic might be upset with me on this one, but even if you eat 100% organic foods, you're still probably not going to get all the necessary things that you need because of the processes that we put our foods through in order to feed the population that we have here in the United States. So just by having that healthy diet, as we like to say, doesn't necessarily mean that you are hitting all the areas that you need to. So if you think back, again, I remember as a kid, we learned about the food pyramid, right? So we had all these different food categories, and it went up the pyramid on how much you could eat. And the one on the top was the one that was the least amount. Well, then we learned many, many years later that pyramid probably should have been flipped upside down. So carbs was kind of the base of our food pyramid back in the 80s, 90s when I was a kid. Really, that should be on the top. That should be the smallest amount. Most of what we eat should be vegetables. I think in the last few years, they've come up with the My Plate idea, and that shows you a little bit better what that healthy diet should look like. Half your plate is vegetables. You've got a small amount of fruit, small amount of healthy meat. You maybe have some dairy on there, but that's not even required for everybody. But the carbs should be a smaller amount as well. So when we talk about that healthy diet, I don't think we really take time in those appointments to talk to you about what that looks like to have a healthy diet. And then again, I brought up the example last episode of my dad when I went to the diabetic class with him, and I said, Dad, don't eat like that or you will always need to be on your medicine. So I think we give a lot of conflicting information about what a healthy diet really looks like. And that gets us into a lot of trouble with, again, all of these diagnoses. But when we talk about lifestyle management, that's one of the first things because, again, I used to be a health and fitness coach for a while too. And the big thing I always taught people is that you can't out-exercise a bad diet. So you have to be eating a good, healthy diet at your base. That will help your immune system and decrease the chance that you might have some autoimmune diseases. If you have autoimmune diseases and you eat really healthy, that's going to decrease the chance that you have other things pop up. If you have diabetes, high blood pressure, any of these things, and you follow a good, healthy diet, that's also going to prevent those complications from popping up with those secondary diagnoses. So, and then if we need to add medications on some of these things, we absolutely can to help chip away at those risk factors and really reduce your risk. Exercise is one other thing that I kind of get on a bandwagon about a lot of times because, again, I used to be a fitness coach, so it's kind of near and dear to my heart. But I think we talked about that a little bit last week too, that when you find an exercise, find something that you're going to enjoy because that will keep you doing it. Don't just try to truck through something because you think you're supposed to. Don't try to hop into CrossFit because that's the most popular thing right now. Find something that you're going to enjoy and stick with it because that's going to be the thing that makes that lifestyle difference for you. And the one thing that I learned that we all learn in medicine as we're going through is that we have to individualize care. So what works for one person might not work for everyone. It is not a one-size-fits-all. You follow this diet, you follow this exercise plan, and you're going to be just fine. You're going to have to make some tweaks and individualize it for yourself as you go along. And again, ask questions if you're not finding the answers that you need to. So for sake of time on that one, I'm going to cut myself off on that conversation and go on to my next topic because I know I could go on with that one forever. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about that physician shortage that Dr. Sinacropi talked about a couple of weeks ago, and the idea of these other people that can kind of help fill the gap. And when I say these other people, I'm talking about myself as a nurse practitioner and physician assistants. And I thought, being that nurse practitioner, it might be a great opportunity to really educate you on what that is, because I know there have been times that I've talked to people and they don't really know what a nurse practitioner is. I think a physician assistant, their title tends to be a little bit more user-friendly. When you hear that term, and it's somebody who assists the physician, and that kind of makes more sense. But the nurse practitioner really doesn't seem, in the title itself, really explanatory of what it is. So as different places that I've worked, they've used different terms for us. One place called us physician extenders. Both the nurse practitioners and PAs, we kind of all get put in the same bucket when they talk about us. So physician extenders, because we extend that service of the physician. So when we talk about the physician shortage and how there's so many people that are not coming into medicine these days and why not, and you can go back and listen to that whole episode that Dr. Sinacropi did, we need to think about how to fill those gaps. And that's where people like myself have come in. We can fill that gap. We can fill that need. You're still getting really good care. The terminology might be different depending on where you go. But again, physician extender was one term that was used. Mid-level provider was another term that was used at one place that I worked, because we're kind of in the middle between the nurses and the doctors. We're not at the same education level as the doctors. We are above the level of the nurses, and we have more responsibility. We've also been called just APPs, Advanced Practice Providers, which really is what we are. That's probably the most accurate, because we are advanced practice providers. We've got an advanced degree. It's not always a doctorate, but it's an advanced degree that definitely got us to where we are. And again, as I mentioned, the NPs and the PAs tend to be put in the same bucket. So then one might ask, well, what's the difference between an NP and a PA then? And honestly, in 2024, there's really not much of a difference. I can tell you, when I first started in healthcare years ago, there was a difference. It was used to be that nurse practitioners could practice independently because we were licensed as independent practitioners, but we couldn't really assist in surgery. That was left to the PAs. The PAs assisted in surgery, and they technically couldn't practice independently because they had to have a physician over them. Those things have changed a little bit. So now here in 2024, a PA can be an independent practitioner depending on the state or the region that they live in, and nurse practitioners can actually get additional training to work in the OR. So that gap is pretty much gone now. So that's why I said here in 2024, NPs and PAs essentially are practicing the same. So again, what do I do? So I've told you a little bit about what we were called and that. But what do I do? And as a nurse practitioner, I like to tell people I can essentially do everything that physician can do except the actual surgical procedure. I can't cut somebody open and take out their appendix or do brain surgery, but I can assist. So we've come a long way in what a nurse practitioner can do, but I don't think we've come a long way in educating the public on what that role is. So me personally, I started out as a 2-year nurse. I had my associate degree. I got spent 2 more years, got my bachelor's degree, got two more years, got my master's degree, and then I decided to go back and spent 2 more years to get my postmaster certificate as a nurse practitioner. It's not really the typical route to do it, but a lot of years of education, and I actually had 3 years of college classes in high school because I was that, on top of things. So lots of education. I have about the same years of education as a physician. That doesn't mean that I'm exactly the same qualified as a physician, but that said, I did take it on myself to do more training because I wanted to be that expert in neurology, and I obtained more certifications. I obtained a certification as a neuroscience nurse and as a stroke nurse, so that increased my knowledge beyond what I was getting on my on-the-job training working with the physicians that I was working with. And over the years, I've had multiple physicians actually explain that I had more experience than somebody that was new coming out of residency, of medical school. So I'd say this all just to tell you that when you go see your provider, if you get assigned to a nurse practitioner or a PA, it's not that you're getting less care, you're getting the same kind of care. And they're going to, if it's something that's outside of the scope of an NP or a PA, we're going to pull in a physician to ask questions. But that's not to tell you that the physicians don't do that same thing. If they get a question that's outside of their expertise or outside of their experience level, they're also going to reach out to one of their physician friends and say, hey, have you had experience with this? Can you give me an answer? So we all work together as a big team. So that said, who else is on that team? And as I started my life in healthcare as a nursing assistant, I like to acknowledge everybody that's on that team, from the nursing assistants to the therapists to the dietary person that comes into the hospital and gets your meal order for you, the housekeeping that keeps the rooms clean, because we can't turn over the rooms if we don't have housekeeping, lab and radiology technicians, nursing and medical assistants. Everybody is all on that team. Case managers, social workers, literally everyone. So we can't do this job in healthcare if we don't have that full team taking care of you. And it is a team. That whole line, it takes a village to raise anybody. It takes a village to take care of somebody sometimes too. And when we talk about that, it sometimes sounds like a bad thing. You've got this provider and this provider and this provider, but we really are trying to do the best to give you the most comprehensive care that you can get. And adding on that, again, just another tangent to throw in there, my last topic that I wanted to really cover today is that idea of what other options we have. So that team does not just include that Western medical team that you can go see in your regular clinic. There are other options, and we've touched on this in previous episodes on what all we can do. We all know, again, that traditional Western medicine, you go in, you get your diagnostic tests, medications, surgeries, yada, yada, all those things. And you may or may not have looked at other options. You may or may not have heard of other options. But some of the other ones that I really wanted to highlight for you, back in 2019, when I found out that I had my autoimmune disease, I was introduced to functional medicine, and that was my first real introduction to it. And I didn't really know what functional medicine was, but the nurse practitioner that I saw in clinic said, hey, I think this could really help you. So I decided to go look, because what else did I have to lose? I needed more answers, and I couldn't get them in my traditional medical office. So functional and or integrative medicine, sometimes those terminologies are used interchangeably. Functional integrative medicine is a whole new avenue in medicine, and I say new, and I'll put air quotes on that one because it's not really new. It's been around for a while, but people are just really kind of learning about it, and it's just now gaining a little bit more traction after years. Because I can tell you, a decade ago, I was listening to podcasts myself, and I heard about these different terms, but I didn't know what it was, and I didn't know where it was. So when I got that experience, it spoke to me on a personal level, because I have always been that provider that wants to know the why. I want to know why my patients have different diagnoses. I want to know why something's going on with them, so that I can help them understand their role in fixing it and my role in fixing it as well. So when you see like images of functional medicine, often it's a tree and you get down to these roots, because they're looking for the root cause. It looks for the root cause of your illnesses. And I like to say it's not just that they say, oh, you have high blood pressure, take this medication. It's, oh, you have high blood pressure. Let's look and see if we can figure out where that came from and how we can fix that. How can we fix your blood pressure so that you may or may not even need those medications, but you're certainly probably not going to need the doses that you might have been on before going through functional medicine. And yes, they still have diagnostic tests, but they're very different. Oftentimes, you're not going to find these particular diagnostic tests in your regular medical clinic, because they don't have the opportunity to order those. Our FDA puts so many regulations on what we can order, what's approved to order on some of these diagnostic tests, and your regular medical clinic just can't test what they need to, or there might not be a test for it. But then you go to a functional medicine clinic and they test, I kind of laugh about it a little bit, they test just about every single bodily fluid that you have to look at your hormones, your gut reaction, what's happening inside your body. We did genetic testing as well. So we did the whole 23andMe as part of this to look at how my nutrition really tied back to my genetics and what kind of foods might be good for me. So it's a whole new set of diagnostic testing that you've probably never had with any of your other providers before. And then they take a much deeper dive into the results to really tell you what foods might be good for you, what foods might be bad for you, what medications might you be okay to take, and what medications are not going to have any impact on your health at all. And it's really cool to look at that deep dive, because they really they don't miss a darn thing. Like those first appointments when you see a functional medicine provider, they're a couple hours in length because they're looking at everything all the way back to when you were in the womb. So when your mother was pregnant with you, we are looking at any kind of health issues that she may have had while she was pregnant that might have an impact on you now. Did she take medications during the pregnancy that may have crossed that barrier to the placenta to get to you, that bloodstream to get to you? So we look at things on that functional level at a much, much deeper level than your regular medical clinic does. And I explain that all to say that there's so much more out there than we typically see. And yes, I work in the typical Western medical realm. But again, at Hypercharge, we're expanding that a little bit. So we've talked about some of these things, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. But we're expanding on the things that we can do for people. Chiropractic care I want to throw out there because I know a lot of people rely on their chiropractors, love them. I haven't had as much experience with it myself, but from my general understanding, it's always been kind of looking at the musculoskeletal system in the body. But I know a lot of people do rely on their chiropractors for supplements as alternative to traditional prescription medications and other approaches to their healthy lifestyles that they can get from their chiropractic care. Again, another option, another avenue that you can look at. Osteopathic medicine, I know this because my ex-husband became an osteopathic physician, and watching him go through that training, it was a combination of our Western medicine and chiropractic care, really. He was going to both schools at the same time. It was a greater focus on that holistic medicine than even our traditional Western medicine topics, though, because that's when I really started learning about the possibility of paleo diet and other things that could be more beneficial than the standard American diet. So it touches on the why people get sick a little bit more and adds those adjustments to keep people in alignment and so that their health just is generally better. So if you have an opportunity to find an osteopathic physician, a DO, doctor of osteopathy, that's practicing osteopathic medicine, a lot of them just go mainstream and they practice the way a typical MD is trained. But if you can find that DO and practice where they're actually practicing osteopathic medicine, you're going to get much more of an in-depth, closer to what you would see in functional medicine. I typically say that the downfall to functional medicine is that it's usually not, because it's not FDA regulated, because they're not being told what to do by the government, it's also not covered by insurance. So some of these other things that are out there are not going to be covered by insurance because they're not regulated like that. But being in that functional world, that's what's so fun about it, because it's not regulated and you can actually treat people really well. And then again, I just wanted to touch on there are other things out there that I don't have as much exposure to. I can't really explain very well, but Ayurvedic medicine is out there, traditional Chinese medicine, homeopathy. And I remember when I learned in nursing school and nurse practitioner school, when we were talking about different complementary and alternative therapies, it was always kind of termed the alternative therapy part of it, including things like acupuncture and Tai Chi. Those things are kind of spilling more into the mainstream medicine now, and you're seeing that more and more as a recommendation of things that you might need to do or that you might benefit from. But as a good friend, Margaret Wallace Duffy always says she doesn't call it alternative medicine, she calls it complementary medicine, because it is complementary to what we typically think of in our medical world. And it's really, really great options for something outside of what you would typically think of in our typical Western medicine world. On the wellness front, I had said I was going to wrap back around to this. Dr. Sinacropi has mentioned this in previous episodes where we're talking about Hypercharge Clinic. Hypercharge is expanding and opening up Hypercharge Integrative Health this fall in Edina. The goal of this clinic is to be the new primary care option for patients when people are seeking more than what they're currently getting in healthcare. At Hypercharge Integrative Health, there will be multiple nurse practitioners, mental health, IV therapies, a taste into the red light therapies, the photobiomodulation that we do in our Hypercharge wellness clinics. So all of that will be there to give another option, again, for healthcare. And he's when you hear Dr. Sinacropi talking, he gets me really excited when I listen to him, because he's got so much energy and so much passion for all of this now, and it just spills over to everybody that he works with. And it's really exciting to see the things that are being built for this hypercharged integrative health, so that, again, we cover things from different angles and we get more of that functional medicine approach, that holistic medicine approach, when we're looking at all of these different options. So we've talked about the medical team. We've talked about what a nurse practitioner or PA is. We've talked about all of these different options. And my big thing is that if you're not getting the answers that you want, if you feel like something's still just not right, you need to be the big advocate for yourself. You need to be the CEO of your own healthcare, because you need to look further, ask more questions. Not every person that you encounter in healthcare is going to be the Wizard of Oz, essentially, the one that knows everything and has all of the answers. But we have resources. So if you need more help, if you just feel like something's not quite right, ask for something else. Look for one of these other options that I've listed out today and see if something might be available in your area. What is there to do? Again, the photobiomodulation, that all the things that we do at Hypercharge, I've seen these things in different clinics around, but never all together in the same one. So that's what's really exciting about that part. That said, though, there are so many places you can go to get help, and I just recommend that you do it. Again, any questions that come up on any of the topics from today, leave a comment. Let us know if you have a question, and we'll certainly pick it up on another episode. One thing I didn't even get to touch on that maybe I'll talk about a little bit more when we come back after the break is the whole mental health thing that we've been kind of talking about over and over again on different episodes, because that's one other part of the team that I just remembered that I forgot to add there, is that we need to really, I know we've talked about this before, but we really need to get rid of the stigma with mental health, because it just needs to be another part of the team. We talk about our primary care provider, we talk about our specialists, we talk about even adding in the functional health, the complementary different therapies. Mental health is right there and needs to be on the forefront also. It's just another one of the appointments that we go to. When I make up my list of appointments as I'm healing from my brain injury, I've got my therapist on there, I've got my primary physician, my neurologist, and my mental health. It's just there because we have, even if you don't have a chronic illness that you have to deal with on a regular basis, you have chronic stress. We all have chronic stress in our life. That leads back to the secondary diagnoses that I talked about earlier. And again, that can just wrap around over and over and over again, because all of these things are interrelated and all of them require our attention. So as we go through week after week in this show and we talk about different snippets, try to piece them together and see where they fit and where they work in your life. And we'll pick that up again after the break. Welcome back again to Recharging the Human Battery here on AM 950 Radio. Again, Dr. Sinacropi has been out today, so you've got just me, Mandi Dickey, nurse practitioner extraordinaire. I think we still covered a lot of good topics today, even without the excitable Mr. Dr. Sinacropi in. So the last thing I want to talk about, kind of as we were leading out in that break, talking about how mental health really kind of wraps into all of this. And I think I could have gone into that even much more in depth today than I did. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about that here at the end, and just how well our mental health, that need connects in with everything else. So mental health, what does it deal with? Our mental health providers help us deal with the stress in our lives, whether it's trauma or just daily stresses, regardless of what we're dealing with. That's what they're there for. That's what they are meant to do, is to help us with that part of our health. Because your primary care provider they're not really prepared to deal with all of those issues that you have. They will typically start the ball rolling and get you kind of aimed in the right direction to get that mental health covered, but you really need to get those mental health providers involved, because stress is often one of those things that is another increased risk factor for so many illnesses. Remember when I talked about at the beginning how high blood pressure and diabetes can increase your risk of heart attack and stroke? Stress can do the same thing. So if you have all these other things and nothing else has changed except your stress level, that can be enough. That can be the straw that breaks the camel's back, as they say. So that gets back to all of those secondary diagnoses that we talked about today. If you have a first diagnosis, even if you're managing that diagnosis well, but your stress level goes out of control and you really are not handling it well, that can be the thing that puts you over the edge to get that next diagnosis. And then, again, tying it into one of the other topics we talked about today, mental health is another area where you're going to see a lot of those physician extenders, nurse practitioners, and PAs because of that physician shortage. And a lot of that is because there's a lot of stress and burnout. Think about how much stress you have on a daily basis. If you go to your provider and talk to them about stress and everybody else talks to that provider about stress, that provider is going to take on some of that. Because in healthcare, we tend to find a little bit more, a few more empaths than we do in the general population. So we feel them. I feel my patients when they come in. I feel the emotions that they have. So I personally cannot work directly in a mental health field because I would have a lot of struggle with that. That said, working in neurology, there was always this fine line between the two, right? So there was always patients coming in that had mental health issues that needed to be dealt with, and they just weren't. So that's another reason, getting back to even Dr. Sinacropi's conversation about physician burnout a couple of weeks ago, stress can lead to burnout. It can lead to burnout in any industry, but healthcare, I think we see it a little bit more because we're dealing with so many different regulations and we're dealing with shortages and there's physician shortages, there's nursing shortages, there's literally shortage in just about every provider area. Even nurse practitioners, we're trying to fill the gaps where we don't have enough physician providers, that we're now running short on nurse practitioners and PAs as well. So it all wraps in together. It used to be in healthcare that we really worked on silos. And I want to talk about this for a second because it's still related. When we think about silos in healthcare, we think about people going into their pulmonary physician to get their lungs taken care of, their cardiac physician or provider to get their heart taken care of. And we do the same thing in our body systems in general. We talk about primary care, we talk about functional medicine, and it all wraps together. We all really need to make it in this one nice little team. So I've talked about the team aspect so many times today, and I really want to kind of end on that, thinking about how we are all a team when we come together, the providers in all these different areas, you as the person that has the diagnosis, and we'll talk about this more and more in episodes to come. Every week we're going to build on this. Every week, if you have something more that you'd like us to focus on, drop us a comment, leave us a message so that we know what we can do to help you. But until that next time, we'll see you next time on Recharging the Human Battery.